I've long been a fan of and proponent of reflection, something we don't do nearly enough. And our guest today is going to help us think about how to do that regularly, intentionally, and effectively. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you see the world differently, lead more confidently, and make a bigger difference both professionally and personally. And because you come here to grow as a leader, I'm excited to tell you about Virtual Leadercon, which we have created and are hosting September 14th through 18th, 2020. If you want the very latest thinking from the top leadership experts with the chance to interact with them and ask your questions, wherever you are from the device of your choice, you will not want to miss this event. Best of all, you can watch it all live for free. Go to remarkablepodcast.com/VLC to learn more and get your free pass. That's remarkablepodcast.com/VLC. We'll see you there. Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. So glad that you're here. I have a really great guest. I just spent a few minutes chatting with him before we started, before I hit record, and I'm excited to share him and his ideas with you. His name is Joseph L. Badaracco. He is the John Shad Professor of Business Ethics at Harvard Business School. He has taught courses on business ethics, strategy, and management in the school's MBA and executive education programs. He's the author of several books, including The Good Struggle, Defining Moments, and Leading Quietly, all published by Harvard Business Review Press. His new book is also published by HBR Press, and that's what we're going to focus on today. And that book is called Step Back: How to Bring the Art of Reflection into Your Busy Life. Joe, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Glad to be here, Kevin.
So here's the deal, everybody. I get books all the time. This is inside baseball. I get books all the time. Sometimes they are a request. Sometimes people say, do you want to see this book or not? And sometimes they show up. I do not know what happened here. But when I saw this book about the art of reflection, I immediately said, if this is as good as I hope it is, I want to talk to this guy. And if it's not as good as I hope it is, then it's time for me to write the book about reflection that I've thought about writing. Joe already wrote it. And so let's just start, Joe, with sort of how did, before we get into the book, no one wakes up when they're 5 and says, I want to be a professor of business ethics. So tell us a little bit about, at least I can't imagine that that's the case. So tell us a little bit about the journey that leads you to doing this work and then ultimately to writing this book.
Sure. Well, I've been teaching at Harvard Business School for more than 30 years. I went there to get an MBA, thinking I'd go back into the so-called real world and get another job. And I really liked the approach to teaching and the approach to research, so I stayed. And over a couple decades, I taught courses on strategy and management. But then about 25 years ago, we decided to ramp up an effort in what we call sort of leadership and corporate accountability. So the basic question is, you're running an organization or part of an organization, and you've got a problem in front of you. And it's got some financial issues, it's got some people issues, it's got some legal issues sometimes, and it's got some ethical issues. How do you think your way through those issues? And I've always sort of liked messy, complicated problems.
Well, you just described them. Right.
So when people said, do you want to help us with this initial effort? I said, sure. And that's what got me on the path to the courses I teach. As for this book, I think like a lot of my colleagues, maybe like you, maybe like a lot of people, you advise other people to reflect. And that sounds like good advice, and it is good advice, but it's never followed up with an answers to the question of what is it, how do you do it, and then when do you find time to do it today? So I wanted to interview people, and I interviewed about 100 executives. Well, they're not all executives. Some were entry level. Some people were CEOs of big companies. And about half the cases, I interviewed them twice. Basic question was, do you reflect? What is it? When and how do you do it? Why is it worthwhile? And at the same time, I was reading some classics of reflection. And I can talk about those a little more if you'd like. And so the book sort of melds these classic ideas with what I learned from really busy people who had managed to find ways to do some reflecting.
So let's talk a little bit, but since you suggested that we could, let's talk a little bit more about that. So when you talk about the classics of reflection, enlighten people about what those are, and then and then secondly, how did you find the melding? Like how connected were they with between the two parts of your research, if you will?
Sure. Well, I think the best single example of a classic is the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius. And I would guess that a lot of the people listening to your podcast have heard about it and have read it. He was a Roman emperor.
Heard of it, never read it. Read quotes from it. Maybe
well,
right?
That's not bad. He wrote this. It's called Meditations, and apparently should be called To Myself. These were personal notes. He wrote them when he was leading the Roman armies in a campaign up in northern Italy. And he was a sick man. He worked all the time. And somehow these documents survived and got published. And you see this guy who was emperor and a general at war, sort of reflecting on life. So this is a classic of one approach to reflection. I wanted to get kind of a spectrum. So you have Marcus Aurelius, who was sort of vaguely religious 2,000 years ago. The other end of the spectrum, I thought, would be St. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. I went to a Jesuit high school, a Jesuit college, and he was very rigorous and systematic. You reflect several times a day, and this is the playbook. This is how you do it. And then finally, I'd always been interested in a third writer, a French writer, Michel de Montaigne, who is famous for his essays, which are essentially about everything. And some of the essays and individual paragraphs are about everything. So you had a really systematic person, that was Ignatius Loyola. You had somebody who reflected when he could and briefly, and that was Marcus Aurelius. And then you had Montaigne, who just let his mind run free. And these are books that have been read, written about, republished a zillion times.
Right.
So that was my sense of the classics of reflection.
So probably the question I should ask next is, so while you and I are both believers in it, and you're right, I am someone who often encourages people to reflect and or asks them reflective questions. Why is it, from your perspective, that reflection is so powerful?
Well, let me go back one step, because a lot of the people who did reflect and whose approach to reflection I reported on, this is how busy people found time to do it. I would say that in at least half the cases, the interview started with somebody saying, I'm not the right person because I really don't reflect. And their idea of reflection was this sort of extended period of tranquility by yourself, sort of going up to the mountain, okay?
For those of you that aren't watching, I was kind of doing the,
yeah.
the guru thingy on the mountain, right?
Yeah, and they said, I'm just not the right person. So I said, well, do you ever take little periods of time to think? And the typical answer was, well, yeah, I actually do. And as we talked more, they had their own idiosyncratic approaches to doing it. They tried to do it pretty regularly, and they found it helped them. It helped them understand what was happening around them sometimes. If they were dealing with a difficult problem, it helped them wrestle with the problem by looking at it from a variety of different perspectives. And then if they had to make a decision that was a tough decision, it helped them put it in the context of what other people expected from them and what they expected from themselves. So I call this sort of downshifting. The classic term is contemplation. That's just what's happening around me, what's happening inside me right now. That's it. The second one I call pondering, which goes back to a number of religious traditions. That's looking at things from a variety of perspectives, rather than trying to solve the problem right now. And the third is measuring up, which has to do with your standards and what other people expect from you. And the big message in the book is you don't need to go up to the mountain. You need to work out a program that works for you. It can be small periods of time, and then use the time well. Follow one of these established approaches that go back for centuries, and good luck to you.
So here's the thing. So you actually gave a name to something that I've been doing and suggest all the time. You called it mosaic reflection. And I'm like, man, that's a good name for what it actually is.
Yeah.
And I want to go back to a couple of the other things that you said, but this seemed like the right time. So say a little bit more about what you mean by that phrase. You've just sort of talked about it in a way,
Yes.
but put some words around that for us.
Well, a mosaic, of course, is an artwork assembled from a lot of little bits of glass or stone. And if you look at it, it's kind of rough. If you get back a little bit from it, there's a pattern. There can be beauty there. And what I found, this was one of the really, I didn't know what I was going to find, but one of the really surprising findings was not just that people had found ways to reflect, sort of in the cracks and crevices of their lives. Those are the little bits of time, like the little bits of stone, the little bits of glass. They had assembled them in a way that worked for them. And there was very little repetition across the 100 interviews. In other words, there were a few people who would get up every morning and systematically, like Ignatius Loyola, they would get a passage from the Bible, from an internet site, and with some guidance to reflection and work on it. There were other people who said that actually would not work for me, but one guy said, what I do is when I'm in the car, he had a fairly long commute, he'd listen to the radio a little bit, then he'd turn it off, start thinking about a problem he had assigned himself when he got in the car, and he had a pad in the car, and he would scribble things down as time went by.
We are not prescribing that to all of you from a safety perspective, but I must say, Joe, that I have also done that. But
or other people would pick up, their phone and dictate something.
Right.
People had so many different times and places and ways where, as the title of the book says, they could just step back a little bit, just briefly, 3 minutes, 5 minutes, and typically do one of the three things that I recommended, that the book recommends: those downshifting, pondering, measuring up.
So we're talking to Joe Badaracco, the author of the brand new book, Step Back, talking about the art of reflection. So I love that you started out with how do we do this in our busy lives? Because everyone who is listening or watching us now has a busy life. I mean, if you have a title of or a responsibility of leader, by definition, right? You got plenty going on, and
Absolutely.
maybe now more than ever. So you've now given us some clues. And the thing I love about the ideas that you're sharing, Joe, are that there doesn't have to be a single right answer, right? So if someone is listening and they're thinking, okay, I like this idea, I buy the idea of reflecting, and yes, you understand me because I'm busy, and I don't really think I do it now, even after you've convinced me that maybe I do, what advice would you give them to start?
Sure. Well, I give two pieces of advice. The first is sort of aim for good enough, okay? You're trying to find something that works for you most days, pretty well. Some days you'll do more, some days you'll do less. The Ignatius Loyola systematic perfectionistic approach is only for a small handful of, I think, really unusual people. So aim for good enough. And then the next initial step is to observe yourself over a couple days and try to notice or make a little note of times and places when the merry-go-round does slow down a little bit. And you may find yourself, looking out a window or drinking a cup of coffee a little more slowly. Or this is something that surprised me. For a lot of people, reflection took place with another person. And there's somebody in their personal life or at work that they could have kind of broader conversation about some issue that was on their mind. And just sort of notice these occasions when you're not processing task after task after task. And you may feel like you're distracted or even wasting time, but you've just paused. And those are the kind of things you want to build on. So for some people, it's, exercising. For some people, it was cooking. For some people, it was 5 minutes before they fell asleep. For some, as I said, for a fair number of people, it was a conversation, not with anyone, but with sort of the right person. So notice those moments. And then the final piece of advice is try to make sure you recreate those moments and then use the time well. And that's where I think these classics of reflection are important. This approach that's either, downshifting or contemplation. And by the way, that's not mindfulness. I was surprised at how few people mention mindfulness. Okay. But whatever just sort of downshifting is for you, and the book gives examples that people have relied on, or you've got a problem, look at it from a variety of different perspectives. That's pondering. Or if you got to make a decision, spend a little time thinking about your standards and the people you work with, the standards that they expect you to meet. So use the time well. Try to be a little systematic once you put the time aside and do one of these three things. And try to do that pretty regularly and see how it works.
So I love the idea of the mosaic and the idea of finding those moments. It's about observing yourself so you can be intentional, right? So your example earlier about the executive that used the time in the car doesn't mean that you can never turn on your radio, right? Exactly. What it means is that, like, I'm going to use some of that hour. And some of you, by the way, are listening to this podcast while you're doing that. So
exactly.
That.
And reflecting a little too.
I'm going to end this podcast the way I end every single one, by challenging people to take some action, which fundamentally, at the end of every one of these episodes, if you've watched before, listened before, you know that I'm actually challenging you to reflect and act every week. So in every conversation. So, it doesn't mean you don't need input. It means that you need to find those moments in your car, when you're cooking, all those things. And we don't just have busy lives, we have noisy lives, right? Radio's on, the TV's on, the podcast is on. Alexa's singing to us. You're on your Facebook, whatever it is, doesn't matter what it is. When do you just turn it off? And so figuring that out for you, you're not being prescriptive, you're being encouraging is what you're doing, I think.
Exactly. Sort of build on something that works for you. But Kevin, I don't want to forget one thing, and that is that this classic image of reflection is going up to the mountain or the long retreat. There's something to it. And what a number of the people I spoke with, a good number of the people, said they tried to do every few weeks was put aside a longer period of time. And it might be a half an hour on a weekend. For some people, it was going to church. Some people said there's too much going on at church after I come back from church. But to spend a little more time in one of these three fundamental classic approaches to reflection. You can't make a really great dinner in a microwave, and you can't squeeze everything into small periods of time. So that would be sort of my final piece of advice. Every once in a while, don't just slow the merry-go-round down. Just get off of it for half an hour, an hour.
And I agree 100%. And that still doesn't have to be a weekend either, right? It can be.
That's right.
My wife told someone else in my presence, Joe, the other day, that I'm not very good at being still, which isn't completely true. But there's truth to it. And so for people who feel that way or think that that's true for them, that doesn't mean that you can't do this either. I would add, not only look for the times, but look for the places. So for me, there are places that are more conducive for me to do that. And I encourage you to think about that. So I have another question for you, Joe.
Sure.
And that is, if we agree, we agree, but if anyone's listening to us agrees that reflection is valuable for themselves, as leaders, we might be taking the next step is how do I coach my team? How do I help others reflect? What advice do you have? I mean, other than getting everybody a copy of the book, Step Back,
Yeah.
what advice do you have for people? How do I help others do this?
Well, it's a great question. To be honest, I haven't really thought about the issue from that perspective. Off the top of my head, I think I would recommend two things. One is, as you're running a meeting, slow the pace down occasionally when you don't have to get something done. And in terms of like pondering, which is one of the classic approaches, say, look, well, let's reflect on this a little bit. Are there other perspectives on this issue that we should be thinking about that really aren't on the table? Okay. And when it comes decision time with you and people on a team, say, let's step back a bit. What are the standards we've got to meet here? Okay. And you could use the word reflection. Let's reflect on these a little bit, or just get to the substance. What do we have to think about a little bit? And I don't know how you exactly do this. One woman I spoke with who ran a staff of about 2,000 people had a meeting for her direct reports once a week. It was lunch, and there was never any agenda. It was like 45 minutes. What's on your mind? And that's almost this sort of downshifting approach. Put the to-do list aside, stop maximizing, stop optimizing, just sort of talk. So that would be my first piece of advice. Secondly, if you're doing sort of one-on-one coaching and somebody really does need to slow down, I'd put that on the table and say, I think you really need to, so many people use the phrase step back. So I'm not trying to sell the book by using that phrase often. I think you need to step back.
Take a breath, right? Take a breath.
Or let's step back together a little bit and figure out what's really going on. So I would do it by example and occasionally call attention to what I was doing.
Well, everybody, for someone who's not thought about it, it's pretty darn good advice right there, I would say.
Well,
we are talking with Joe Badaracco. I got it wrong again, Joe. The author of the brand new book, Step Back, How to Bring the Art of Reflection into Your Busy Life. The subtitle tells the story of this conversation as well as the book. Joe, you didn't write it just for leaders, and that isn't even who all that you spoke with.
Yeah.
But since most everyone who's with us right now are in some sort of leadership role, what other advice, maybe something we didn't talk about or something specific that you would share for leaders, perhaps, that you think they ought to think about or reflect on?
Moving beyond the book.
I'm sorry?
And moving beyond the book.
Yeah, answer it however you wish, right?
Well, I'll say just a little bit about the topic I'm intrigued by now, which might become a book in a couple of years. And that's this idea that we have a moral compass and we should listen to our moral compass and follow it. And I think that's an important but hazardous idea, because the idea that we have a simple little directional device inside ourselves that will sort through all sorts of complexity out in the world, our complexity inside us, and just point us in the right direction is not a very sound idea. Okay? There are an awful lot of things that disable and disorient that simple version of a moral compass. I don't know if you've spent time with some of your listeners on these famous Milgram experiments, where people volunteered to help with an experiment on learning.
Yep.
People off the street, all walks of life, within an hour, they were sitting at a shock generator panel, flipping switches, and they thought they were giving electrical shocks to somebody who was another volunteer. And they did it to the point where the person could have been unconscious. They couldn't see them because they were participating in an experiment. And where was their moral compass? It just seemed to have been completely overridden. On the other hand, we do have a deeper sort of sense of what a moral compass is. And what I want to try to explore and do through interviews is what that is. And what I'm calling it just temporarily now, provisionally, is sort of personal moral wisdom. So we each have our own sense of how the world works, what matters, what's important, how we make a difference. So it's personal, it's partly about other people, and it's about how the world works. And I think this notion of personal moral wisdom is kind of our real moral compass, but you don't just pull it out like a Boy Scout or a Girl Scout. You think about it, you struggle with it, you reflect on it for a little while. And I want to give some real flesh to the personal part, the moral part, and the wisdom part using interviews. So that's what's kind of on my mind right now.
Listen, everybody, you got plenty to think about, reflect on when you step back after this conversation. So, Joe, when you're not challenging students and challenging us through your words and your writing, what do you do for fun?
Well, my wife and I both like our work, so we work a lot. And, I like doing things with students and teaching students. I like to cook. I go for walks. I probably, with all due respect, Kevin, listen to too many podcasts. I've started listening to yours now. There's so many great podcasts out there. And I read probably more magazine articles I should relative to books, but there's just so many great things you can find online.
Well, that's true. There's some not so great things you can find online, but there's a whole lot of great stuff we can find. And that's the viewpoint that I have as well. So, but speaking of books, what are you reading that's not a magazine article these days?
Well, I mentioned the course I teach where we read works of literature. So I'm now rereading, I guess the first time, I don't know, it was high school or college, The Plague by Albert Camus. And I'll teach that. It's, I'm about a third of the way through it. And this is about a plague, a pandemic that took place in Northern Africa. But the first part of it is just remarkably like what we're all going through now. The public health efforts, the difficulty that different people have acknowledging, recognizing what's going on, the uncertainties about what's really going on, the reluctance to go along with quarantines. It ultimately becomes a more serious book, as you probably know, about how people with death all around them think about their own lives and the role they want to play. So I think it's going to be a really good book. And of course, I'll have 90 students in this class, and a number of them will have had friends and family members touched by COVID-19. So
almost for sure, right?
Yeah. So that I'm reading, and then in view of all these issues of racial justice and injustice that have been in the news, I picked up a book by an African-American woman writer. Her name is, I think, Karen Reed, and it's called Such a Great Age. And I'm only maybe a quarter into the book, but it's about a woman in her early 30s who's hired a Black babysitter just out of college, trying to find herself in her early 20s. And I think they're trying to get a sense of each other's worlds and becoming aware of the points where their worlds do actually connect. And at the same time, big disconnects. It's very hard to really understand someone else's experience. So I think that's what the book is going to be about. And so far, it's a very readable book. That's what I'm reading now.
Such a good age. So, all right. And so Joe, if people want to learn more about your work and specifically about this book, where should they go? Where would you point people to connect with you or learn more about the book?
Well, Amazon.
Naturally, right? Amazon, step back and you'll find it, right?
Yeah, and there will be reviews soon and things like that. I hope there'll be lots of reviews in prominent places. I hope when we can go back to airports, they'll see it right there in the carousels. But if not, try Amazon.
All right, beautiful. Thank you. So everybody, the question as I teased you earlier. I would ask you this question. The question is, now what? I challenge you to step back and think about what you got from our time together, and think about not just about what did you get, but what are you going to do? What action might you take? You got some ideas from Joe about how you might begin to reflect, even if you think you don't have time. And you got some maybe it's a chance to observe that maybe you actually are and you didn't realize that you were. But what ideas do you take from this? Maybe the idea is, how do I take the time, or when do I take the time to ponder on the tough issues? Maybe it's about how do you downshift, or when do you downshift? Maybe it's thinking about how you model this with your team. But my challenge to you is to take action on what you got from this, because that's where you will get real value. So Joe, thanks so much for being here. It was truly a pleasure to have you.
I enjoyed it, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
We've been trying to make this happen for a while. We had fits and starts, and we finally made it happen, and I'm so glad that we did. So everybody, before we go, we'd love to have you join into our conversation, get updates on what we're doing. We're continuing to make some changes about how we're going to do this podcast moving forward. We'd love your input, and you can do that by joining us on your favorite social media site, as long as that's either LinkedIn or Facebook. So you can go to remarkablepodcast.com/Facebook or remarkablepodcast.com/LinkedIn to easily find the links to those two groups. And we hope you'll join us there. We hope you'll come back next week for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Thanks, everybody.